Thank you for joining us for panel number 3, The Path Out of Extremism. I'll be serving as a moderator for the panel today. My name's Pete Simi. I'm a sociology professor at Chapman University. I've been working in the area of violent extremism for the past nearly 25 years. And I'm really excited today to be joined by my two guests here. I've known them both for a number of years, worked with them both, and they both are doing really important work in the field of violent extremism, and in particular in regards to disengagement from violent extremism. And they both have important personal experiences in terms of journeys away from different types of extremism. And so I want to allow them both to introduce themselves, Tony McAleer and Sami Rangel. Tony?
Hi, I'm Tony McAleer, co-founder and board chair of Life After Hate, and author of the just released book, The Cure for Hate, former white supremacist journey from violent extremism to radical compassion. I spent about 15 years in the violent far right. I came from a middle-class, affluent family. My father was a psychiatrist, and I found myself down at Aryan Nations, hanging out with skinheads and becoming not just a follower, but a leader in that movement. And left about 20 years ago, and I'm able to understand my journey through the insights that I've gleaned from over 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group counseling, and I'm motivated by the desire to help people who are where I once was, and that's why I work with Life After Hate.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Pete. I'm Sami Rangel. I'm the executive director of Life After Hate and also one of its co-founders. Life After Hate, we all kind of met up in Ireland for the first time as a group. There's a number of co-founders that are responsible for being here today. And one of the things that I remember about that meeting was that we all had this sense that it would have been nice to have some sort of support from someone who had like direct experience, who could influence some of our thoughts and behaviors instead of having to go through that process alone. The change process is a very lonely process without that, and is wrought with a bunch of potholes and blind spots and mistakes that can be costly. And so we decided to come back from that, one, with the sense that it would be helpful, but two, that we owed a debt as being formers who have lived in a space for a long time, spreading hate, using violence to communicate that hatred and indiscriminately. Today, though, after 16 years of prison, after about 20 years of living in that life, I dedicate all of our efforts towards helping other men and women address those same concerns. We try to make an actual business case for these men and women to consider change. There's oftentimes a lot of doubts about what's waiting for you on the other side of that change, and not only just doubts, but fears around what your life is going to be like, and not necessarily being comfortable with what you assume the alternatives are. And so kind of helping people talk through that, walk through that, work through that. Tony talked about 1,000 hours of personal work. It takes thousands of hours. It takes months and years. I've been out of prison 20 years, changed for about 22 years, and I'm still working through things. So it's an ongoing process, and we feel that our role right now is helping in a space that has really been neglected. There isn't a lot of culture or competency in working with men and women trying to leave these violent far-right groups. As we heard from other panels, there isn't a critical mass of approaches to this, of theories to this. We're all, I think, trying to operate in a space to create that, but we don't do it together enough. And I think if anything comes out of these panels, it'd be nice to know that we've introduced ourselves to each other, and maybe from there we can leapfrog forward to figure out how we can come together as a mind to address this national and international issue collectively.
Great. Thanks. Thanks to both of you for the work that you're doing. I want to kind of start off a little bit broad And actually want to come back to you, Sami, in part because of some of the things you just said about this process being the lonely one. Oftentimes when we think about the path out of extremism, we think about individuals and individual journeys, but it's really a societal issue, right? And some of the things we do as a society can make a difference and make it either easier or harder in terms of that pathway out. And so one of the things I've heard a fair amount over the years is this idea that you have, I think, within some of the kind of general public thinking, this kind of mindset that once an extremist, always an extremist, once a hater, always a hater, this type of thing. And so I'm curious to get both of your thoughts. I'll start with you, Sami, in terms of, I guess, if this is something you see as an issue, how do you respond to it, if so?
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up. You know, a grain of sand is not a beach, but you can't have a beach without all the sand, right? And so all those granular parts are critical and are important to take into consideration when trying to help intervene in these kind of cases. I do think that historically we have gone through various populations believing that those populations cannot change, that they can't be redeemed, that they're broken beyond repair. We've thought about that when it comes to addictions. We've thought about that when it comes to criminality and reentry. We've thought about that when it comes to certain mental health problems. But all the research supports us, all the evidence supports us. Life After Hate is full of evidence of people who have gone to great depths, but who are now going to great heights to work through these issues. And so while I do believe that it can be a very difficult process and undertaking, while there isn't a single approach that works well above others, we have some best practices, we have lessons learned, and I think it's important not to lose sight of the civil rights path that we're on. We can't afford to give up our commitment to staying true to that path. Although I can understand why some of our society is starting to feel frustrated and perhaps considering abandoning ship when it comes to staying in my opinion, you know, there's this higher path of morality, this higher path of conduct, this higher path of perhaps like the spiritual intelligence around compassion, empathy, and love, right? We want to abandon that out of frustration because we see maybe 50 years of work being undone and rolled back. We see groups talking about civil rights as an undermining to American values, and so we start to question whether or not we're having an impact. I don't think we can afford to get caught up in that type of terrorism and that type of hatred. I mean, that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to break you down. It's designed to break you apart. It's designed to put so much fear and doubt into you that you become a silent victim and an anonymous victim. And I think we just heard from the last panel a great story from a young lady who's decided at a very young age to represent an entire generation of people who she'll probably never meet, but who she will influence. That's the example we have to follow.
Yeah, amazing courage there. Tony, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and as, you know, Sami's got a great quote that I talk about all the time, and that's "No one is irredeemable." And you know, the hardest thing in the world to do is to have compassion for someone who has no compassion. But I think sometimes they're the ones that need it the most. And you know, as human beings, we operate from one of two places: we operate from love, or we operate from fear. And sometimes it's a difficult choice to want to operate from love, particularly when we find the activities and the ideology of people completely abhorrent. And I think it's important, you know, as a society that we do call people out, but I think it's also critically important that we also call them in at the same time and provide a pathway back to becoming productive, compassionate human beings that make society better than if they stay out of it.
Great, thank you. So, not to get too technical, but in the field of violent extremism, there's some terms that I think are important for us to discuss in terms of, for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with some of the different ways of kind of describing different aspects of the kind of path out of extremism. And oftentimes in the field, there's a distinction made between disengagement on the one hand and de-radicalization on the other. And so I'm wondering if maybe we start with you, Tony, this time. You can talk about that difference, why it's meaningful, and how Life After Hate maybe utilizes these concepts.
Sure. So disengagement really is just it's step one. Okay. It's let's leave the movement behind. Let's leave the social circles behind. And for me, I remember when I went through my disengagement, it was I was going to keep my identity intact and just work on raising my children, but I still had all of the same beliefs.
Okay.
And I remember when I walked into my counselor's office the first time, and somebody asked him, who was the Tony that walked into your office that day? And he said, well, Tony had left the movement, but the movement hadn't left him. So it's in that first stage where people's identity is still wrapped up in who they are, and it's a process before they get to the next stage, which is de-radicalization, where they start to lose, abandon, dissolve the ideology that they once held. And even in that stage of disengagement, it can be an incredibly lonely process, because you have to, when we go into a violent extremist group, we basically excommunicate ourselves from friends, family, and society. When we go to leave that violent extremist group, we have to excommunicate ourselves again, and friends, family, and society aren't waiting with open arms to welcome us back. And so we spend a time in the middle I call the void, where we don't have a social circle. And one of the amazing things that Life After Hate has done is created an online social peer support group in which people don't have to be alone as they go through that journey.
Okay, great. Simi?
Yeah, I think just to put it in layman's terms, I started a support group called Formers Anonymous after I met Life After Hate and after we went to that summit in Ireland. And there is a difference between stopping a behavior and changing a behavior. And oftentimes stopping can lead to change, but sometimes stopping can also lead to going back to eventually the behaviors that you've tried to stop. Stopping is what a lot of people do, and that leads to a number of problems and leaves you exposed to a lot of risks that you might not be aware of. We negotiate with change, so we think we can do a little bit of the old behavior and consider that sufficient, and only to find ourselves maybe in a full-blown relapse of some sort, right, through behavior, actions, substances, whatever that might be. And the disengagement isn't always because they've had a change of heart. In fact, I would argue that they may just be disgruntled with their direct peer group, or they may have had some sort of disillusionment from incidences like Charlottesville. Well, Charlottesville led to a number of calls coming in from across the country by men and women questioning whether or not this was something they were signing up for when they signed up to support these types of events and these types of groups. And so a lot of times they're questioning, and they're at a very vulnerable moment at that point. And so consider a society who's meeting that vulnerable moment with anger, aggression, or kind of a rejection, like tarring and feather people right out of town, right out of jobs, right out of schools, right out of homes, and what that might do to that person. That opportunity was missed, and that person may go right back to where they came from, believing that it's the only safe place, even though it's not something that they're completely satisfied with. It's better than what was waiting for them at that last moment. Or consider the opportunities that can await that person if there's someone there who's receptive, non-judgmental, who's willing to validate them as a human being, not necessarily their perspectives or ideas. And I do think it's important to, in the disengagement, not to glamorize these ideas that they're thinking about changing, because when we talk about it as a movement, civil rights is a movement. White supremacy and hatred and that type of ideology is not a movement. And so it's really it's a criminal enterprise. It's a criminal process where people use hatred as the main weapon in this sense. So we also have to be careful in how we're dissecting and talking about these issues, because to me, when I hear movement, it sounds like a social justice cause, and that's how they want to be perceived. That's how they. And so if we reinforce that, it's almost like a gang member saying, "I'm going to retire." You're still disengaging, but you're following the rules of the gang versus rules of society, rules of morality, rules of ethics, things like that. So I think we have to be very careful, and that's why these moments are so vulnerable, and why I think you have to have people who have the cultural competency to step into those spaces. But we also have to teach society how to do that, because Life After Hate can't be everywhere, right? And so we want to scale that, and we want to share that with people. The disengagement piece is absolutely the most important moment in that person's life, because most of those experiences are going to shape the next few decisions that they make for the rest of their lives.
So some of what you just mentioned kind of foreshadows what I'd like to discuss with you next, which is I think a lot of folks have concerns when they hear about an effort like Life After Hate to help people disengage from violent far-right extremism. Well, what happens if these folks go back? and what kind of risks, are present in terms of that happening, and how does, an effort like Life After Hate kind of address those issues? And, Tony, you want to?
Well, there's always the danger that people will go back, people will relapse, and I think all we can do is to provide and encourage to keep the process going, to take that next step, because disengagement is not the end point. It's just the beginning, and as an organization, we're not happy, we're not satisfied if someone just disengages and that's it. We want to get them to de-radicalization, we want to get them to healing, and we would ideally like to get them to helping heal the communities that they've once harmed. So it's trying to provide that constant forward momentum, but nobody's perfect, and people will relapse.
Okay.
Can you cover that again? Like, repeat what you're asking. I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Sure. So how does, address the concern that I think a lot of folks have in terms of, what's the risk of when you're trying to help people leave these types of extremist groups, of them actually ending up relapsing or going back?
Sure. I think psychological safety is critical in this space, and it's up to us to provide that psychological safety, right? We can't guarantee learning, but we can guarantee a safe space in which learning can occur. And by that I mean we have to create a society that recognizes that people need to be held accountable. Because when we talk about compassion, we talk about empathy, that's not at the expense of healthy boundaries and limits, as Tony always talks about. It's not at the expense of responsibility and accountability. It's kind of like that restorative justice approach, right? People, men and women who are in this kind of life of criminality and hatred and violence, they know right from wrong. It's not an issue of whether or not they're ignorant to right or wrong. It's the idea that when we're addressing those wrongs, if we're doing right or wrong in the same process of trying to hold them accountable, right? And that can really stigmatize them against some sort of intervention if they feel like their human rights or their self-worth is being minimized or kind of erased as something important. That's why I think human rights are important for all people. Civil rights are important for all people, including those people that wish to do us harm. That process is in place so that we remain intact with our own humanity in the process of trying to restore humanity in some of these loveless spaces, right? These dark spaces. And so the risk, we have to accept that we can play a part in increasing the risk or in minimizing the risk for someone to relapse. There's all kinds of evidence that approach matters more than theory. And so if we're going to hold somebody accountable, I think we have to do that from a place that respects humanity, that respects a person's dignity, even though that doesn't need to communicate some sort of concession on our part about their ideas or the thoughts that they have, nor does it mean that we have to condemn them in the process of holding them accountable as a human being. We can condemn actions without having to condemn a person, shun them away from life. We see what happens as a society. We have a lot of historical context to look back on when we look at what does collective shaming look like, what does historical shunning look like, what happens when we talk about a swath of any society as incorrigible or not worthy. Those are the things that contribute to risk. Risk is always there, but we can minimize that risk by creating psychologically safe environments where these changes can be talked about in a way that those men and women can actually swallow what we're selling. Like if we're coming at them in the wrong way, we only are working against ourselves in this space.
Great, thank you. So, the previous panel dealt with this problem of online radicalization. And I'm curious, what does this mean in terms of approaches to help folks disengage when you're dealing with somebody whose maybe involvement has been purely online, as opposed to someone who's offline meeting, with groups, going to rallies, that kind of stuff? Does it change the process by which you use to try and help individuals in terms of intervention?
I would say definitely. And if an organization trying to work in this space isn't also dealing with the online risks, the online factors, the online components, the online technology, the tech groups that are behind us, the major platforms, if we're not working in that space, we've just kind of ignored an entire community where these things are festering, right? And so it's important to have a presence. It's important to consider that in your strategic planning. It's important to actually maintain I think a safe space for people online as well. I mean, we heard stories of people completely radicalized online, and if that's where they're at, that's where we need to be at, and that's where we need to position ourselves. And while I can appreciate pulling down websites, and Tony has kind of taught me about that suppression really is not the answer and is a contributing factor to more risk, right? And so we have to be creative in the way that we're addressing what we feel needs to be suppressed. Not that it shouldn't, but that shouldn't be the catch-all for what we're doing. And so we've created, I think, some innovative approaches to this. Our We Counter Hate project was, I think, in my opinion, and it could be toot my own horn here, but I feel it was kind of a really ingenious way of doing something about online hate on an open platform called Twitter. And this was in the era where everyone was trying to pull everything down. And we were like, we don't want to get into censorship. Like, that's not what we want to do as an organization. We can understand it, but that's not our job. Somebody else can do that, right?
This is We Counter Hate.
We Counter Hate on Twitter. And basically all we did was stand right next to hateful messaging and say, hey, we see you. And the impact, the immediate impact was like within seconds, that hateful tweet slowed down in the share rate by 65%. 16% of those tweets were self-deleted. 30% of those accounts, which was an unforeseen consequence, had nothing to do with Life After Hate, but 30% of those accounts were then reviewed by Twitter to see if they were in violation of some sort of terms and conditions violation, right? And so all we did was stand next to it. We found a way to share space, pixel next to pixel, on a place that was really unregulated, and we got people to think about their behavior, to change their behavior, and then others to react differently based on what we were doing as well. And it didn't include condemnation, and it didn't include conceding.
Okay, great, thank you.
And I think with social media, people think no one's watching, right? There's the bravery that comes from the isolation and operating as if no one's watching. And when people find out that there's someone watching, it's all of a sudden they become self-conscious of what they're doing. And I think also with the populations, University of Maryland has come out with a data set of people that are 100% radicalized online without a human being connecting them to any movement. And the demographics of that may be different than the demographics of of your traditional skinhead or neo-Nazi type of white supremacist groups. There's underlying drivers which are similar. So with the protest, it'd be a little different, but in some aspects, it's very similar.
Okay, great. And Life After Hate's focused on interventions aimed at violent far-right extremists. In your views, though, do you see disengagement differing substantially across different ideologies, or do you see large degrees of overlap, more or less?
I think in the beginning, what I've seen is that if you can create some sort of dissonance between what they're thinking and what they're doing and the potential for change, it doesn't really matter if you're talking to someone who's anti-government, anti-religion, anti-immigration, anti-LGBTQ. While you need to know some things to be good at that about those particular groups, the underlying dynamic is that you're still dealing with a person who has extremely faulty thinking, extremely faulty emotions, the way they rationalize, the way they've been able to dehumanize themselves and others in order to carry out some of these thoughts and actions. But at the end of the day, again, I think the approach matters. We've never been accused of sympathizing or validating those types of actions, but what we have been recognized for is our ability to make a connection with another human being who is really questioning whether or not this is the life they want to continue in. And we recognize it as a vulnerable moment, and yet almost everyone in Life After Hate has something in common, that we were approached at a moment when we were at our worst by someone who knew we were behaving at our worst, but who still found a way to humanize us through their own actions, which causes kind of like this crumbling of your global narrative, because when you see all these people as this particular way and then you run into someone who doesn't match that narrative, it forces you to consider if there are other exceptions here, or is there something wrong with my theory, and how come this person doesn't meet the stereotype that I've been told or that I've held up all this time. And most of the time what that causes is some sort of break in the defense mechanisms that they have, and now they become willing to kind of look at you a little closer and maybe consider things that you have to say. And so that's why we keep going back to, you got to have a high tolerance and I think know yourself pretty well to stand next to some of this hatred without getting so consumed that your ego overrides your best practice, right? And so we have to spend a lot of time working on that as professionals to get in this space. But I think absolutely it's one of those things where if we're not mindful of what we're doing, how can we help someone else who's not mindful of what they're doing get to a better place?
I think that speaks to the compassionate approach that Life After Hate embraces. Personally, I believe that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mere reflection of our own internal disconnection and dehumanization. And when we're compassionate with someone, it's like we hold a mirror up to them and allow them to see their whole humanity reflected back at them when they can't see it when they look in the mirror themselves. And I think that's the gift of compassion. But sometimes it's tough. You got to have those healthy boundaries and consequences, and you have to park the ego at the door to be present and be able to deliver that effectively.
And I just to add a little bit to that, I think what's really critical, what's behind that, is the ability to validate a person. And it's so simple in how this happens, but I think we would all agree that it's not happening across political divides. Listening to a person's grievances and or experiences is so validating. It doesn't mean that you agree just by listening. And that's why, but most people think, well, if I'm listening, I'm kind of conceding, aren't I giving something valuable away, like my time or my mental space. But when sometimes just the act of listening is enough compassion, it's enough empathy, it's enough of a foreign concept and experience for most people that you're kind of stunned by the fact that somebody just heard out some of your craziest ideas, thoughts, and emotions around these things, and didn't judge you, didn't feel the need to challenge you at that moment, but literally heard you, right? And that is, I think, a part of that, creating that psychological safe space. It didn't involve what they anticipated, which was rebuttals, challenges, denial of what they had to say. Most people want to be heard, and that's why they're screaming. And that's why they're not screaming because they don't think you can hear them. They think there's just too much distance between me and you. And so when you create an ability to close that proximity to people, it's an intimate moment that they lack in every other space in their life. In most cases, by the time we get to them, even with their own groups, the intimacy is gone because they get disillusioned to, this is where we've come to realize the ideology is no longer the ideology. It's not what holds them together anymore.
Right. To paraphrase Dr. Brene Brown, who's done some amazing work around compassion and vulnerability, when a person can be vulnerable in a space without judgment, their shame begins to be washed away, and it's a place where healing can occur.
The last panel talked about a mother who'd written an op-ed discussing the issue of this kind of online recruitment that we're seeing among white supremacists through gaming platforms and various social media platforms. Life After Hate's increasingly being contacted by family members of somebody who may be kind of going down the so-called rabbit hole. Like to hear how Life After Hate's kind of responding to that demand from parents or siblings or other family members.
Wow, that was a major left turn for us after Charlottesville, And I think we should define what we mean by interventions, because we're not out there doing cold calls, right? We're not out there knocking on unsuspecting white supremacist doors and saying, hey, we love you, can we hug you, can we talk? I don't recommend that for anybody. It's kind of foolish. However, before Charlottesville, almost 100% of our caseload were individuals seeking us out for themselves. Since Charlottesville, half our caseload has become family, friends, and significant others. So that means that's a paradigm shift that we have to make. And we're also being pushed to make another paradigm shift in not just focusing on adults, but trying to address the issues around youth risk and involvement, right? We don't turn away cases, but we also don't specialize yet in youth youth programming, but we see the need. Like we have to get there. You know, we have to get there. I think one of the reasons I was brought into this space deeper as the ED was because of my social work experience, and what I realized traveling the world, there aren't a whole lot of social workers in this space. But I think the space needs social workers because social workers understand like systems and ethics and other ideas that maybe other practitioners and administrators and academics don't really operate in. That social work concept that we can bring to this space helps us look at all the things where we have to take responsibility for the outcomes and yet try to figure out what are the best practices to reach people, who needs to be at the table. That's why I'm so concerned about critical mass. Like we're out here operating, but we don't really even have partnerships with a lot of the people here. You know, like it's important that we create partnerships, that we spend a lot of time talking about each other, about these things so that we can address these issues. The families that need our help, we often don't even get to talk to the person they're concerned about. We end up doing like target hardening. We end up helping them insulate themselves, but we also try to convince them that, you know, you don't necessarily have to write your son or daughter off permanently in this situation, but we may need to establish healthy limits and boundaries, and this is what that might look like. And in addition to whatever insight we can share with you, we have to try to find services at a higher level of care for you and your family to get additional services to what we can offer. But we have to adapt to that. We can't just say, oh, you know, we're only working with this. There's not enough of us for us to say that. You know, it's kind of like first aid. We got to give it as much as we can, and then try to bring anyone in who's willing to help in this space, who can demonstrate the right ethics, the right morality, the right patience, the right, I guess, just the right approach to this space, because there's so many people knocking on our door right now, and we believe the door has just cracked. It's not even fully open, but once that happens, what are we going to do? Because our systems will be overwhelmed once the word gets out that there is hope for these things.
And I think the family dynamic adds a layer of complexity to it as well, and then dealing with just the individual, and there's the complexity that comes with. It's not uncommon for the family dynamic to be a part of the problem, you know, and a part of the anger that's being acted out and such like that. So that requires a whole other skill set to unravel. And I wish we had more resources to refer to.
Yeah. In one particular case, Pete, this young man who caught the FBI's attention, dad was in the military, and he watched a Blue Lives Matter like a commercial or something, and he walked out of that feeling that the Black Lives Matter movement was trying to kill his father. A single online experience drove this kid towards adopting some of these ideas that opened him up to a whole slew of other types of hatred, and then like older men realizing he was vulnerable and then trying to wind him up very quickly to commit an act. Like within days of meeting these men, they were trying to wind him up to commit some sort of act.
Wow.
Do you know what I mean? And so, you know, to that, the complexity of that, you know, and think of it, was his motivation hate or was it love for his father? But then when Tony talked about the complexity of the family dynamics, dad's nowhere to be around because he's a special operations army guy who's gone 3-4 years at a time. Do you know what I mean? And so realizing like there's a family dynamic that we have to address, right? It does get quite complex, but we would be derelict to not take those things into account, you know, when these families come to us. So you know, we need help. Like how can a single entity address all of those different dynamics and risks?
Maybe this isn't a fair question to ask, but I'll ask anyways. What do you say to parents who say, what should I be looking for? What can parents do in terms of on their end to kind of try and screen this out or, you know, be more prepared?
I would say proactive. I think if you're waiting for your son to be isolated in his bedroom 10 hours a day and coming home with a fash haircut, you're kind of too late. I think it's establishing healthy relationships with your children early on. I think I've raised 2 teenagers and 2 adults, and it's creating that safe space to be curious about your child's life and have this open dialogue about who they are, how they see themselves in the world, how they see the world. And I think if you have that safe, open space from the get-go, you should be able to have a chance of picking up things when they start to go sideways. But everybody's often too busy, you know, and we don't always have the time to get to know our kids until they're adults, and it's too late.
Yeah.
I agree with that, and I, you know, as a parent, I've only been out of prison 20 years, you know, and just seems like yesterday on some days. And what I've become as a parent today is light years where it was compared to then. What I realize now is that you have to be emotionally and cognitively available for your children, you know, and as a father, it's important for me to hear from my children. And my kids share things with me that, quite honestly, I can understand why parents don't want to hear it. It hurts. It damages you as a parent to hear some of the things they have to go through and face and decisions they make on their own. But if I don't create that space where they can tell me those things, who are they telling? We did an intervention in Buffalo, and this man was talking to us because he was starting to focus on a local mosque, and his hate was ramping up. And one of the things we ended up meeting with the imam of that mosque with this guy, and the imam said something that resonated with me, that just sticks. He said, these kids, these men, these women are like ionized atoms. They're missing a proton, and they're vulnerable to whatever protons are in the environment. And this is where I think Life After Hate recognizes that proximity of our message matters, but we're severely outmanned, right? Like, it's one organization against an international attempt to flood the internet with information, but we can project and put our presence out there so that there's an alternative. And I think that's why redirection efforts and methods can work. Because where there may not otherwise be other types of messaging or other opportunities or other windows to look out, where are they looking? So as a parent, I think you have to be creating those windows of opportunities for dialogue. I can say probably hands down 100% of the cases, there's always, and not trying to make light of it, but there are always mommy and daddy issues. Always mommy and daddy issues. And if you can get at the heart of some of those mommy and daddy issues, parents not on the same page, parents have particular political views that lent itself to somebody who's vulnerable in that family to kind of go down further, deeper down than those families intended. You know, divorce, working 2 jobs, working 3 jobs and still going to school. Like, all of these things are, yes, you're doing it for the benefit of the family, but it could also be at the expense. And so we sometimes have to have very frank discussions around family dynamics and saying, these aren't necessarily your fault, but these are things that could be contributing to. And we have to do something about that. We have to work on getting the family to have dinners together, to talk openly about this. Can you have the tolerance to hear the ugly stuff coming out of your kid, you know, so that they can feel that you're listening, able to listen? Because the reason I think they're focused somewhere else is, Tony's good at talking about this, they're getting some need met that isn't getting met inside their own home. And the families are really the front line, are probably going to be the first ones to know there's something really wrong here and I need to do something about it.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important there too, is if you're not listening to your child, who is? And it reminds me of a letter we received after Charlottesville from a mother who said, my son's 18, he's got Asperger's syndrome, and he's found this white nationalist community online, and he's up to his eyeballs in it. She said, what terrifies me the most is this community has accepted and embraced my son in a way that no one has in his entire life. When he was 12 in grade 7, he invited the entire class to his birthday party and nobody showed up. And you have to, someone's listening, you know, and they have a direct route through the internet into your child's bedroom.
Yeah, it's powerful. So, you know, both of you have gone through major transformations and gone on your own journeys. So I'd be remiss, and I think that it's important for the audience to hear a little bit about how you were each able to kind of go about those transformations, and what things, if you had to, you know, kind of a nutshell type thing, boil it down to a few things, what was most important, how did you do it?
I think it's important to recognize I tried to change at least 10,000 times in my life and only got it right once. And I can tell you those other 9,000 plus attempts were categorized by others in ways that would make it seem like I really wasn't trying to change. But trying to change and knowing how to change are 2 different things. Most people fail at even just trying to change what they eat. How much they walk, how much they exercise, sitting up straight, like drinking more water. Like we fail at some of the simplest things, and yet we expect like a person to make an entire lifestyle makeover with ease. And we're extremely judgmental when people fail at these attempts, when I think we can learn something from those failures rather than just shunning someone because of those failures. And then, of course, taking responsibility for our part in the failure as well, right? What was really critical for me, and I think this is something that I've noticed as a theme throughout my career, but especially at Life After Hate, is that there were people who showed up in an environment. Literally, the environment was absent of love, and so was I. Like, I wasn't giving love, I wasn't receiving love. And this environment was not a loving environment. It was a cruel environment. I was in a maximum security prison. Inside that maximum security prison was a maximum security segregation unit. And underneath that maximum security segregation unit was what was called the basement, which was isolated cells kind of reserved for the state's worst inmates. Me and another inmate were down there for 2 years. And I spent the majority of that 2 years strapped to a steel cot just inches off the floor with my lights on 24/7. And they would have to hose me down because I couldn't get up to use the bathroom. And all my meals were being condensed into a loaf of bread, and I was being hand-fed by the security director who I felt I was at war at and was trying to kill me at the time. Now, I'm not looking for sympathy in this story because I was that dangerous. I was acting out that dangerous. I earned that position, but you can see that 2 wrongs don't make a right. That's extremely dehumanizing, inhumane conditions, even though I was acting in the same fashion. Somebody came to my cell maybe after 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, and they did something, and you have to really understand this dynamic, right? You might not get it, but he knocked on my cell. You just got to think of how crazy that is. I'm in the basement, inside this prison, chained down. Nobody knocks on your door. You don't have visitors. People just open and close that door as they please. And he knocks on the door, and then he says, "I want to talk to you." I hadn't been talked to in years at this point. That interaction was above my head. I didn't understand any of it the way I do today. But I can tell you that it had an impact. But that doesn't mean that within the next couple of years, I didn't beat up a total of like 8 more guards. It didn't mean that I wasn't transferred an additional like 7 or 8 times for security reasons. I was even refused entry into a prison at that point. When they tried to transfer me for security reasons, the receiving prison said, "He can't come here." It's completely, I've already been kicked out of the world, and I've been kicked out of prison. Like, where do you go from here? Do you know what I mean? But that knock on that door planted a seed that really took hold years later. And it affected me, though. It affected me to the point, I did say I assaulted 8 more guards after that, severely, so much so that I was given convicted of new crimes against those officers. However, after each one of those assaults, I felt bad. But my response wasn't to respond to the feeling of hurt or shame, guilt. My response was to try to erase it by being more violent. But it wasn't working because the damage or the gift had already been done, right? Like, I was already affected in a way that I couldn't undo by this guy's simple act of compassion and empathy and kindness and love. And when I wrote him a letter from another prison, I said, "Hey, I don't know what you did to me. I don't appreciate it. Nobody gave you the right to do that to me." And he wrote me back a very simple letter. This was a staff of a maximum security prison. He says, "It doesn't matter what you do. I'm still going to love you." That was a deeply hurtful moment, but it was hurtful because it was ripping off the hate, the scabs of hate that were just encapsulated all over my heart and opened me up to some sort of love and compassion. This was such a foreign concept to me at this point. I'm still in that was back in 1994. I'm still in contact with that guy now. He's much like my father figure at this point in my life, a mentor, a healer, somebody who has made me look at myself, but I've never once felt judged or belittled or pitied by this man. So, and I think that example is very rampant among other men and women in Life After Hate. We all have very similar experiences.
Thank you for sharing that, Simi.
For me, again, that's that power of compassion, and my first real taste of compassion came from my children. If I think of where I was at that time in my life, I was completely cut off from my heart, operating from ego and narcissism. Someone asked me once, Tony, how did you lose your humanity? I said, I didn't lose it. I traded it for acceptance and approval till there was nothing left. And in that place of ego, where identity and ideology are so intertwined, there was nothing you could have said to me through my brain that the ego wouldn't have built up walls or discounted. But when my children, I'm holding my daughter for the first time, and I had a son 15 months later, and I got to parent him the way I always wanted to be parented, and they looked at me with the unconditional love, and they saw this magnificent human being that I didn't see when I looked in the mirror. It started to shift things. But I was still tied up with the identity piece to it, and having my teeth knocked out in my living room in front of my children was a powerful, moment. I thought, what am I doing? And and I left to be a single father of these two children, and I still had the ideology behind, but that was when I sort of separated. My mom came in, and my mom had unconditional love for me. But my relationship with my mother was very conditional. My parents despised what I did. My dad was bombed by the Germans during World War I, so he was pretty angry that I had a picture of the guy who sent the bombs on my bedroom wall. And she leveraged that, my needing to have her help me raise these two children, because even though I was 26, 27, 28, I was still a boy. And so she leveraged that. That was the first time I learned compassion with healthy boundaries and consequences as a powerful tool. But it really wasn't until I met my mentor, the guy who did the counseling work with me, and I became a financial advisor in 2004. I left the movement in 1998, and I started to go through all these personal development workshops, and how to earn more money and all of that kind of stuff. And that was my motivation in going. And he was an English guy. He was 10 years older from Manchester. I'm from Liverpool, and we bonded over Monty Python and stuff like that. And I went through these programs for about 8 months, and my life started to take off, and things were getting better. And the guy who introduced us gives me a gift certificate for my birthday, and I open it up, and it's like, great, therapy. Who doesn't want therapy for their birthday? It was an introductory counseling session, and I go into that session, and I tell him why I'm angry at my dad, and his betrayal, and all of these different things, and I stop when I think about telling him about all the stuff that I got up to as a skinhead, the violence, Aryan Nations, and all of that, and I didn't want to tell him, because when people found out about that in my past, that was the end of the relationship. And this was a relationship that I greatly valued and treasured. And this guy was trying to help me. And he goes, look, mate, it's okay. It's like you're trying to swallow 3 golf balls. Just let it out. It's safe. And I think I stared at the carpet looking for an answer of what to say, and nothing was there. And he urged me a bit more, and I said, what the heck, and I let it all out and gave him the Reader's Digest of all the stuff I'd been into. And the more I tell him, the more he starts smiling. And I get really annoyed, because here I am being vulnerable. It was my very first counseling session ever in my life, and this guy's laughing at me. So I said to him, what's so funny? And he leans in with a big grin on his face. He goes, I'm Jewish, right? And I thought, of course. Of course, the irony of that wasn't lost to me, and there was this man who loved me, wanted to see me, help me heal, and everything like that. And here I was sinking in my chair in shame, knowing that I'd once advocated for the annihilation of him and his people, and that receiving compassion. If he could love me, then I could learn to love myself. Receiving compassion from someone who we feel we don't deserve it from was an extremely powerful gift, although I'm not saying it's the responsibility of marginalized communities to take that on.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing, Tony, and thank you both for sharing your stories today, but also the work that you're doing at Life After Hate and the approach that Life After Hate's taking, the intervention efforts. We've had, violent extremism is a depressing topic, a tragic topic, lives lost alone, damage that's done to society as a result of violent extremism. These are depressing issues, but the exit from extremism, disengagement process, the potential for people to change are all kind of opportunities for hope. And I appreciate you taking the time today to share with us. I want to thank USC Price and the Safe Communities Institute, and wish everyone well. Thank you.